Music machines in Minecraft have always had a problem. They're kinda slow. Sure, it can work for your ballads and your blues, but they have a hard time recreating EDM and pop songs. But what if they could be faster? Fortunately, there's someone willing to try that. This is Vlad. He had a simple question of if it would be possible to play music with a 10 Hz hex signal. Unfortunately for him, 10 Hz hex is rather difficult, so he asked for help. With my knowledge of high-frequency redstone, I figured it would be easy to just give him the solution he needed. But the device didn't work, and neither did that one, or that one, or that one. We pretty quickly figured out that we would need a new strategy. Multiplexing was the strategy we needed. A multiplexer is a device that chooses between multiple inputs and provides one as an output. If we connect the multiplexer to a clock, then it will switch between both inputs quickly. That allows us to combine two 5 Hz signals into a single 10 Hz signal. Now that we have a 10 Hz serializer, we might as well combine two of those to play together at 20 Hz. Now this device takes an encoded string of hex values and uses a red coder to choose which note block to power. Now that the device is complete, it's time to show it off. And Crafty Masterman's Redstone Submissions livestream made the perfect opportunity.
Oh, they have fan art. Fan art?
Yep.
Where are the note blocks? Oh, they're at the front. Scale. Oh, it's just the scale. Ooh, that definitely sounds like 20 Hertz. Wait, what? Why is this
The fact that
one
it's
different?
20 hertz is like
Yeah, that's crazy.
really cool.
Wait, how?
Because like
How do
then
you-
you can actually play a lot more songs.
How do you load this? I don't even know.
Yeah, I have no idea how that works.
Oh,
I'm gonna be honest.
oh, you offset it.
Subtick,
That's how.
or game ticks, whatever
You
they're
just
called.
spat on my arm. So I assume for these they use a
note
program.
block stuff, I'm like, oh, Jazzy Rat.
I'm sure there's way more complexity than that.
It is my dream to do a 20 hertz one. This
We're
is like
just
such a
gonna-
daunting. Oh, 9cat.
Yeah, if Jazzy says
big.
it's daunting, it must be way more complicated than we think.
Cool.
Very cool.
Cool no block player. Moment.
Oh, they're collabing. They're collabing in chat.
They collabing.
The guy who made the music thing is like, hit me up,
Oh
Jazzy.
shoot!
Oh, collab.
Collab.
Yeah.
Collab. Oh my God, it's Mumble Jam.
So we're collaborating then. Jazzy Red, Mooncatcher, Vlad, and me, working together with the goal to make the absolute best music machine ever. The first step was to determine where each of our previous designs had fallen short. I'll assume you've seen Jazzy and Moon's music machine, since it's got a couple million views. But if you haven't, then you should give it a watch. Anyway, Jazzy and Moon said that there were still some problems with their music disc reader, and that they were only able to play a few notes from each instrument at a time. My and Vlad's design had an issue where if you tried to play a note twice in a row, then the redstone would be held on instead of being triggered again, so the note block would only play once. We also had a much more strict limit on the number of note blocks, with only 15 for the whole device. So we decided that the new machine should contain every note of every instrument, and that they should all be individually addressable, meaning that playing a specific note block does not limit which other note blocks could be played. Basically, every note block could be played all at the same time. We also knew that we had to stick to a speed of 20 Hz. Vlad and I had proven that it was possible, and we're not ones to back down from a challenge. The biggest challenge is speed, so let's start there. How can we even play a note block 20 times per second? Well, that turns out to be quite complicated, so there's some background info we'll need to learn first. There are 5 main types of redstone components, but only 2 of them are important for now. Those 2 types are instant components and scheduled tick components. Instant components are the easier of the 2 to understand. When an instant component, such as a redstone dust or a note block, receives a redstone update, it will immediately check if it should change state. If it does change state, then it will send redstone updates to all of its neighbors. This ends up chaining updates with a, mostly, depth-first approach. Scheduled components include things like repeaters, comparators, torches, and observers. When these components are updated, if they determine that their state should change, then they will schedule themselves to change after a certain delay. Most components wait 2 game ticks, so that unit of time has become known as 1 redstone tick. It's confusing, I know. I'll stick with game ticks for now, though. It should be pretty obvious that instant components can run at 20 Hz. They can turn on and off with no limits to their speed. The fastest speed most scheduled components can change their state is once every 2 game ticks, which would be only 10 times per second, or 10 Hz. So there's immediately a problem. How can we deliver a 20 Hz data stream if our components are capped to 10 Hz? What's more is that it requires very careful setups to even make these components run at 10 Hz in the first place. Let's start with the very first step to tackle this problem, just getting a single note block to play steadily 20 times per second. A standard fast redstone clock is a good start, but it's not nearly fast enough. This signal is on for 2 game ticks and then off for 2 game ticks, so the cycle time is 4 game ticks, which gives us a speed of 5 Hz. Note blocks only play their note on the rising edge of a pulse. How can we even make 20 rising edges per second if it takes 2 game ticks for our pulses to even turn off? It's like we need the redstone pulse to turn on and then back off within the same game tick. Oh wait, that's totally possible. Now introducing the third type of redstone component, the block event. Block events are a kind of weird hybrid between instant updating and scheduled ticks. They do get scheduled, but not for a delay of any number of ticks, but for later within the same game tick during the block event phase. This means that they always happen later, but still within the current game tick. We can use this to create redstone pulses that turn on and back off within one game tick. These pulses are called zero-tick pulses. Let's take a look at how we make them. I'm going to use tick freeze and tick step to slow down time for this demonstration. I'll also add a command block that makes a sound every game tick to help you follow along. When we pull this lever, the redstone dust will activate instantly. When the repeater receives an update from the dust, it will schedule itself to change state after 2 game ticks. After we step 2 ticks, the repeater will send out its updates. The piston will react to these updates by immediately scheduling itself, and then by starting to extend. Remember that the piston schedules itself for later within the same game tick, so I cannot tick freeze between those 2 steps. So based on the order of events there, we can see that if we add another repeater here, then both repeaters will power before the piston starts pushing the block. We can use the block as part of the circuit, so that when it's pushed, it immediately cuts off the redstone dust, thus depowering it. Let's see that in action too. I'll turn on the lever, which will power this repeater, so both repeaters are scheduled to turn on in 2 game ticks. Did you hear that? The note block just activated even though the dust is now turned off. This repeater powered the note block before the piston started extending, but now, since the piston is in the process of extending, the block cannot transmit the signal anymore. Now, a couple things I need to bring up before I'm flamed in the comments. The order of these 2 repeaters is ambiguous and directional. This would be a problem if you wanted to power a piston with a zero-tick pulse, because it may not have enough block event delay. But we don't have to worry about that in this case, because we're only powering instant components with this pulse. Now, we just need to find a way to provide 20 zero-tick pulses per second. Since the repeaters and pistons cannot be run at 20 Hz, we'll need to use multiple copies of them, all offset from each other, in order to generate the pulses. But one quick thing first, we can simplify the circuit by relying on quasi-connectivity. The piston and redstone dust can both be powered from one repeater. Okay, back to combining multiple zero-tick generators. We'll need to set this repeater to the second setting so that the sticky piston will pull the block back down. This repeater now has an 8 game tick cycle, because it takes 4 game ticks to turn on, and then 4 game ticks to turn off. So we'll need 8 modules total if we want one to activate every tick. And we'll have to be careful with our signal strength now. There's no way to boost signal strength without extending the length of the pulse. So we'll have to move everything close together. Now, we just need to find a way to power them all in a cycle, one after the other. It's very difficult to create a 1 game tick delay, so instead we'll split the top and bottom pistons into their own circuits and separate each of those modules by 2 game ticks each. Then we'll power the top and bottom ones separately with a 1 game tick offset between them. So let's connect our clocks. They also need to have a cycle of 8 game ticks. We can add repeaters to adjust the cycle. Now we just start the clocks with an odd game tick delay between them, which can be done with this fancy scaffolding setup. And just like that, we've got a single note block playing at 20 Hz. A quick side note, there was this weird solution I tried with jukeboxes to make a 20 Hz clock that was completely silent except for the note block, but it was too large and used too many minecarts to be practical. Anyway, now that we've got a note block playing at 20 Hz, we need to make it encodable, so it only plays exactly when we want it to. If we add a comparator to each zero-tick generator, then we'll be able to enable each module individually by ensuring that the dust on both sides of it are turned off. Then we can connect all the inputs together. Then if we connect our clock to the enable line, then we can cycle through all the different possible outputs. Now, only one of these comparators is being enabled at a time. Now, if our data line is off, then nothing will be played. But if the line turns on, then we'll get a sound. If we send a short pulse, then the note block will play only once. You may be tempted to use repeaters for the clock signal, but comparators are important because of their low tile-tick priority. I'll explain more about tile-tick priority later. An optimization we can do now is to only enable the clocks when the data is coming in. We'll have to add delay to the data to give a bit of time for the clock to turn on, but it's worth it. Now this device just needs 2 streams of 10 Hz data, offset by 1 game tick, that will then be combined into a single 20 Hz zero-tick line that the note block can play. But how do we generate those streams of 10 Hz data? That would be part of the transcoding process, but first we should figure out how our data will be encoded. Music disks are by far the most space-efficient option for storing large amounts of memory. You probably know by now that when a comparator reads from a jukebox, it will output a signal strength corresponding to which disk was put in. Signal strengths are equivalent to 1 hexadecimal value, which is equivalent to 4 bits of information. So a whole shulker box can fit 108 bits, and a double chest of shulker box can hold 5,832 bits. That's about how much data you could fit on 10 punch cards in 1950. Well, that makes it seem a whole lot less impressive now. Anyway, discs are the only practical choice for us. Jazzy and Moon's old music machine tried to read discs at double hopper speed, or 1 disc every 4 game ticks. This didn't go well for them. Even in their final design, the disc readers are still broken. So we decided to use multiple hopper speed disc readers instead. After a quick Google search, I determined that there were no good pre-existing hopper speed disc readers, so I'd have to make my own. I'm very much a perfectionist, so I had some strict rules for the disc reader. It had to be 2-wide tileable, always hopper speed, fully independent from neighboring modules, toggle stateless, entityless, small, and it must support partially full shulker boxes. Development on this component alone spanned the entire development of the project, from conception to the very end when we were still finding bugs with it. I guess the difficulty of making this system is the reason why there were no existing designs. But after 5 months of development and so many revisions, it finally worked perfectly. Let's take a look at that final design. There are 3 steps that are required to read data from boxes of music disks. First, the disks must be pulled out of the shulker boxes. Then, the disks must be put into a jukebox where a comparator can read them. Finally, the disks must be packaged back up into shulker boxes. This dispenser is where it all starts off. When the machine is started, this dispenser will place the shulker box. The box will be read through the soul sand by this comparator. So if the comparator is on, then that means there are items in the shulker box. But when the comparator turns off, we know that the box is out of items and must be replaced. Since hoppers take an item once every 8 game ticks, we only have a short amount of time to replace the box to give the system the next item in time. If we count up the delay, 2 game ticks for the comparator, the trapdoor and wall are instant components, the observer takes 2 game ticks, and the dispenser takes 4 game ticks, then we find that we're perfectly at that limit of 8 game ticks. Oh, and the piston breaks the existing box while the dispenser is waiting to fire. The piston pushes the empty box across and into the hopper under the soul sand. Soul sand is one of the few blocks that can be read through by a comparator, but also doesn't block the hopper's ability to pick up items. After the dispenser places the new shulker box, it must be restocked. The comparator on this side measures the contents of that dispenser and will unlock the hopper whenever it is empty, thus allowing another shulker box to flow down from the chest above. Now for the next phase, reading the discs. This next stage feeds off of 2 inputs from the first stage. The discs themselves are pushed into this dropper one at a time, and the shulker box detector is used to start an 8 game tick clock. The clock is required to trigger droppers to move discs throughout the system. You may wonder why we don't just use hoppers for everything. They don't require a clock. The answer is because hoppers are actually the worst components ever created. Hoppers fall into the fourth category of components, block entities. All of the first three categories behave predictably. Instant components update immediately, chaining updates in the process, so they're handled depth first. Scheduled ticks all update in the order they're created. Block events also happen in the order they're created, but with no delay between them. But block entities are random. Whenever a chunk is loaded, all the block entities in that chunk are given an order. They update every game tick, and their order is completely random. And it changes every time the chunk is loaded, so it's consistently inconsistent. Hoppers cannot be trusted. That is why, in this device, there is only ever one hopper between scheduled components. The 8 game tick clock is required to precisely time the movement of items through the system. The first thing this clock powers are the droppers, where the items are unloaded to. Before we read the disks, we must first filter out any items that aren't disks. That's what this dropper does. It attempts to place every item in the jukebox. All disk items are able to be placed in the jukebox. The jukebox then holds the disk for just long enough to be read by the comparator, and then the disk is pulled out by the hopper minecart below. Now, why is there a hopper minecart? Wasn't the system supposed to be entityless? It was, but annoyingly, jukeboxes immediately power everything around them as soon as they get a disk. This means that a hopper under it would be immediately disabled, so a hopper minecart is unfortunately required. Hopper minecarts fall into the fifth category of Redstone components, the entity category. Entities are updated every game tick after scheduled tick. Because of this, the hopper minecart would pull disks out of the jukebox immediately after they're placed in, but we can use activator rails to disable the hopper minecart. The activator rails are connected directly to the system's clock, so the hopper is disabled and enabled at the correct times. Now, any other items that aren't disks are unable to be placed into the jukebox, so they end up stuck in this dropper, left to be pulled out by the hopper below. Those items go straight into the shulker loader and are ready to be put back into the boxes. With the hopper here constantly trying to pull items, we must be very careful not to let any disks be sucked up. If a disk item exists in this dropper for longer than one game tick, then it will be pulled out. So we must ensure that that never happens. These two droppers form an instant dropper chain. The second dropper fires directly after the first within the same game tick, so any disk items that pass through only exist there within the scheduled tick phase. They are gone by the block entity processing phase. While that works in theory, there are problems when it's done in practice. These droppers were the cause of the majority of revisions to the system. The problem was directionality. This was the dropper setup that we had for the majority of development. If I put an item in the first dropper and power the system once, then it will pass through both droppers and fly out the front. This will always happen when the system is facing this direction. But if I rotate the system, put in an item, and then power it, then the item just gets stuck in the second dropper. Only if I power it again will the item fly out. This is due to the order in which components power other components. In this case, the power source is an observer, but most components, besides redstone dust, all behave the same way. It'll be helpful to pull up the debug crosshair now, because we'll need some directions. When the observer turns on, it will first update the component directly in front of it. This block space is the origin of the power. There's just a solid block at the corresponding spot in the dropper system, so it won't do anything. Next, the observer will power in the negative X direction. Again, nothing will happen. Then positive X, before finally powering negative Y. The dropper system does have a component in this spot, and the component will react accordingly. The dropper is a scheduled tick component, so it will first check if it should change state, and then it will schedule itself to activate in 4 game ticks. Then the observer will continue to power positive Y to negative Z. Negative Z is where the observer itself is, so nothing happens. Finally, it will power positive Z, where the note block sits. The note block is an instant component, so it will immediately start updating its neighbors. First at the origin, which is where the note block sits, then negative X, negative Y, positive Y, negative Z, and positive Z. The second dropper is in the negative Z position compared to the note block, so it updates at that moment in the chain. It schedules itself for 4 game ticks in the future, and it will update after the first dropper because it was scheduled second. Now, what's different when we rotate the system? Even when rotating the observer, it will still update components in the same order. First, the origin, which is a solid block, and then at negative X, which is now the note block. The note block will immediately update the second dropper, and that dropper will schedule itself first. the observer will continue updating at positive x and then negative x, which is where the first dropper is sitting. The first dropper is scheduled after the second dropper, so the second dropper will fire first, but will not yet have an item. After the second dropper fires, the first dropper will fire, thus leaving the item inside the second dropper. The most obvious solution to this problem would be to just put the first dropper at the origin point, since that point always triggers first. But if we do that in the disk reader system, then since the dropper is a solid block, the other components next to it would be powered as well, like this hopper, so we can't do that. Luckily, there is a less conventional solution that relies on TTP. TTP, or tile-tick priority, is a system for repeaters and comparators to schedule them earlier in the scheduled tick queue. Remember how the droppers always updated in the order in which they were originally powered? Repeaters and comparators can skip ahead and be processed earlier than other components in some specific cases. If we can force one update to always happen before another one, then we can reliably schedule the droppers in the correct order. So how can we do that? There are 4 distinct priority levels. A level of 0, which is given to most components most of the time. This is the default priority, and it's the lowest level. Then there's priority -1. Priorities are confusingly assigned in a negative order, but -1 is a higher priority than 0, meaning any components with this priority will update before those with priority 0. The priority -1 is given to any comparators that are pointing into the back or side of a repeater or another comparator, as well as any repeaters that are currently off and will be turning on. Priority -2 is given to any repeaters that are currently on and will be turning off. Priority -3 is given to any repeaters that are pointing into the back or side of another repeater or comparator. The most important thing to note here is that repeaters always have a priority greater than 0, so repeaters will always power before observers. Observers have no special cases, so their priority is always 0. Back at the disk reader, we can see that this repeater will always update the first dropper before the observer updates the second dropper. This ensures that the droppers always power in the correct order. What's interesting is that this repeater isn't providing power to the dropper. The block in front of the repeater is a composter, and composters are transparent blocks that do not conduct power. The first dropper is actually being quasi-powered from the note block above. The note block is getting powered from the observer, but it is out of range to update the dropper. The dropper must wait for the repeater to turn on to get an update. Because of the timings of this clock, this observer is always scheduled to turn off in the same tick that the repeater is scheduled to turn on. But remember how repeaters always go first? This repeater will always update the dropper before the observer has a chance to turn off, and then, of course, the second dropper will be powered by its own observer. Maybe by now you're starting to see why it took so many revisions to make this system reliable. There are so many little things going on in this small space, and we haven't even talked about the shulker loader yet. The shulker loader is simple, in theory. It should just repackage the disks back into boxes, but there are some nuances that we need to account for. Since we plan on supporting partially full boxes, we can't just detect when the box is full to determine when to break it. Instead, we have to use a signal from the disk unloader and wait a bit for the items to trickle through the system and back into the box. So the timing of the box filling up is based on the timing of the box above emptying. When the box is finally broken, it needs to be picked up by a hopper. The hopper set up beneath the box is known as a precision hopper. The hopper normally stays locked, but it is unlocked in the same tick that the box is broken. Since block events always happen before block entity updates, the block is broken and picked up within the same tick, so it has no time to get lost anywhere else. Now we've got a disk reader that outputs hexadecimal at 2.5 Hz, as well as a note block player that takes input as 2 offset 10 Hz binary streams, and somehow they need to be connected. So we need an intermediary device that converts the signals. This turns out to be pretty easy. Luckily for us, since one hexadecimal value is equivalent to 4 bits of binary, the rate of data is the same for the two. So we'll end up with just 2 disk readers per note block. So now we just need a device to convert hexadecimal to binary. A device like that can be created by just testing for the value of each bit and subtracting that value. For example, testing if the value is greater than 8, and if so, subtracting 8. You can do the same for the values 4, 2, and 1. The problem with that is that it takes 4 game ticks per bit to convert the data, and we need to have just 2 game ticks between our bits or the machine will run slow. Luckily, this space has had a lot of previous development from other people, so there was already a perfect solution thanks to Rubik's to Slime. They created a hex to gray code converter using HLP. But what even are gray code and HLP? HLP, or the hex layering problem, is a way of chaining together simple hex-based modules called layers to build more complex logic. Each layer is defined by barrels that store specific signal strengths. When you stack enough layers, you can represent any mapping of inputs to any output values. kind of like a lookup table. Rubik's found a way to take outputs partway through the layers instead of just using the final output. Doing this, they were able to convert hexadecimal signal strengths into a gray code output. Gray code is an alternative binary encoding to the more common weighted binary encoding. Weighted binary has a specific place value for each bit. For example, the rightmost bit is worth 1 and the leftmost bit is worth 8. Gray code uses an encoding such that each number only has one bit different from the last. Both gray code and binary have a unique sequence of bits to represent each value, so they are equally valid ways of representing information. Now, with the data converter sorted out, we should just be able to connect the devices. I'll test out this box of discs, and it should play every 4th game tick. Let's put it in and try it out. Let's take a look at what's going on. The discs are being read correctly, the decoder is decoding properly, and the note block is doing nothing? It's not even turning on. The problem is right between the decoder and the note block player. The data is just disappearing. This issue shows the ugly side of TTP. Remember how TTP forces specific components to be processed earlier than others? That is the crux of the issue. The repeater is being processed before the comparator. The repeater is always turning off before the comparator has a chance to turn on. Let's look at a smaller example and use the power of tick freeze and the schedule tick visualizer mod to inspect the problem. I'll once again set up a command block to play a sound every game tick. If I turn on this lever, then in 2 game ticks the repeater will turn on. That's noted by this trigger value. The priority shows the priorities that I talked about earlier. Repeaters have a priority of -1 when they're currently off and are going to turn on. If I step 2 ticks, then the repeater is on. Since the input into the comparator has changed, the comparator is scheduled to turn on in 2 game ticks. If I step 2 ticks again, then that's exactly what will happen. So what's causing the issue in the machine? Let's do this again, but this time I'll turn off the lever after 2 game ticks. Turning it off immediately schedules the repeater. If we look at the priorities, we can see that the repeater has a higher priority than the comparator. So now, if I step, then the repeater will turn off before the comparator can turn on. When the comparator updates, it will see that its back input is 0, so it will output a 0. Comparators always check their back and side inputs when they update to determine what their signal strength output should be. But not all schedule tick components have to check their input again before turning on. Scheduled repeaters will always turn on no matter what their input is at that moment. Anyway, if repeaters are the issue, then what if we just use comparators? This setup does work perfectly fine. If the lever is powered for 2 game ticks, then the signal will be propagated through both comparators. But that isn't what the decoder looks like. The decoder has multiple inputs all feeding into the same output. Let's see what could happen if those inputs were comparators instead of repeaters. Remember that each input would be turning on one at a time, so that the data can then be combined into a single output stream. I'll use a setup like this to emulate the structure of the decoder. If I turn on all 3 levers for just 2 game ticks, then the output should stay on for 6 game ticks. And if we try it, and then count how long the output stays on, it worked as expected. So now let's try leaving the middle one off. If the middle one stays off, then there should be a 2 game tick gap in the output data. So turn on the outer levers for 2 game ticks, and then look at the output. And it stays on for all 6 game ticks? Since the comparators always have the same priority, there should be no issues. We'll have to double check the scheduling to figure this out. I'll set up the situation again. And at this point, the output comparator has a higher suborder than the next input comparator. See, not only do we have to worry about the priority of the components, we also have to worry about the order those components are being processed. So despite the fact that these comparators have the same priority, the input comparator will still turn on before the output comparator. This order is shown by the suborder value above each component, and that suborder is what will cause the output to stay on. If we replace the output comparator with a repeater again, then we'll see that the high priority of the repeater negates the unpredictable ordering of the comparators to perfectly output the combined signals. So we're stuck then. A repeater is required in order to correctly combine the outputs from the decoder, but repeaters break the system because of their high priority. It's almost like we need a device that could convert signals at repeater priorities into signals at comparator priorities. So I made a device that can convert signals from repeater priorities into signals at comparator priorities. Just plug in any sort of 10 Hz signal into the repeater here, and it will be perfectly converted to comparator priorities at the other end. This device abuses a quirk of observers to force a comparator to accept a signal of any priority. Let's take a look at what makes observers so special. For this demonstration, I'll be comparing the suborder between these three simple setups. First up, the repeater. When I turn on the lever for 2 game ticks, the repeater turns on, and the comparator gets scheduled to turn on. If I turn off the lever, then the repeater gets scheduled immediately. We know that the repeater has a higher priority, so the comparator will not turn on. Next, the comparator. When I turn on the lever for 2 game ticks, it will schedule the next comparator. When the lever turns off, the first comparator is scheduled second, so they will both update. First, the second comparator will turn on, and then the first comparator will turn on. This is how comparator propagation works. The later comparators must always have a lower suborder. And finally, the observer. If I flick the lever, then the observer will be scheduled to turn on in 2 game ticks. And when I step 2 game ticks, the comparator will be scheduled to turn on. However, the suborders are different from what we'd expect. The observer has a lower suborder than the comparator, meaning that the observer will turn off before the comparator has a chance to update. Observers are special because they do not need to wait for their input to turn off, so they will always reschedule themselves before they schedule anything else. Now, we can abuse this property of observers. If we make a redstone clock and hook it up to an observer and a comparator, then the comparator will be scheduled, but will never turn on. Now, if we add an extra observer and offset it by 2 game ticks from the first, then we will constantly schedule the comparator, but the comparator will still never turn on. Now, this comparator is always expecting a signal, but never receiving it. So what if we give it a signal? Well, then it turns on. And if we try it with a 2 game tick pulse from a repeater, then it still turns on. The repeater always turns on before the comparator because of its high priority. But since the comparator is already scheduled, the comparator will turn on when it updates because it has a source of power from the repeater. This comparator also appears to be instant since it will always update after the repeater. It will always turn on in the same tick that the repeater turns on. This technique is called comparator priming, and it can be used to make some crazy instant logic. But for now, I'm just using it to convert priorities. Okay, back to the music player. If we put this rectifier into the chain, then everything should finally work. And if we test it out by putting a box of discs in the back, then it should play some notes. Perfect. After months of development, it finally works. So now we just have to assemble it into the final machine. Don't forget that each note requires 2 disc readers, so we'll have to duplicate most of this logic. Also, we must push the disc readers really far away from the player. Jukeboxes can be heard within a range of 64 blocks, and minecarts can be heard from 128 blocks. Counting every note of every instrument leaves us with 400 different note blocks that need to be in the system. Note blocks can be heard up to 64 blocks away, but the volume falls off really fast after 40 blocks, so all note blocks should be within 40 blocks of the player. The note block player is relatively large, so it may be difficult to fit all the notes in this space. Jazzy and I eventually settled on a layout of 7 modules wide and 15 modules tall, and then we removed the 4 corner modules since they were just barely outside the 40 block range. Let's test just this one wall before we copy it to the other sides.
Alright, are we ready to run it?
I think so.
Yeah, very strange. That first chord does not exist in the M.A.E.S.T.R.O song.
And
A bunch of extras.
Yeah, that's to be expected. Nothing ever works on the first try, but it shouldn't be too hard to fix. But now that that's fixed, we can copy it to all the walls before adding the final touch, the decoration. Jazzy asked his community for submissions to decorate the machine. We selected 12 submissions from 5 different artists to include, so the machine was finally complete. And to go along with the machine, Vlad has been working on a program to convert songs from NVS format into a world edit schematic so we can easily test out songs. So now, I present to you the M.A.E.S.T.R.O, the Multi-Aural Encodable Synchronous-Tick Redstone Orchestra. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see whatever crazy devices I make in the future. I think I can promise that they'll be cool. And also check out Vlad's and Jazzy Red's video about the NVS converter and the story of this machine, respectively. The world download for this device and a link to the song converter are in the video description, and thank you for watching.